Welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's the third in our series of 10 top tips webinars, having heard from Maria Phillips on TV and Vicky Reeves in MEM last week. This one is on digital fundraising. And next week's, if you haven't yet signed up for it, will be Fundraising Strategy Director Claire Daniels talking about fundraising strategy. So if that's your bag, please sign up for that if you'd like to attend. It's still available to register on the original registration link. But today's all about digital fundraising and digital marketing. So I just wanted to briefly fill in any gaps for you about why we're here talking about this today. Many of you on the call will know WPNC already, but for those of you who don't, we're an agency working across channel, digital and other, and in particular with the charity sector. And you can see here some of the types of clients we work with across all different elements of the charitable not-for-profit sector. Many of whom we provide multi-channel services, and many of whom we provide very specific digital services. And you may know WPNC for a whole bunch of things. One of the teams, however, that we have within the agency is a specific digital channel marketing team. And the tips that we put together today and the experiences that we've used to produce those tips come out of that team, which works across all of the different marketing platforms as you would expect. And one of the interesting things I think about what we do with clients is we can either do completely managed campaigns for them, or we can work in a blended way with their in-house team or with their partners. So we've got a lot of experience in working out tactics and strategies to help charities achieve their goals across all of this landscape. So that's just to fill in a few gaps. We put together 10 top tips, since that's the intention. I'm going to try and move through these reasonably quickly in order to make sure that we've got plenty of time to do questions at the end. Feel free to use the Q&A Zoom feature in your toolbar or post them in the chat. This morning I have Vicky Reeves and John Eversley, our joint MDs, on the call as well, so they can keep an eye on the Q&A as we go forward. And I think it's really just worth covering off that the tips that we put together are focused mostly on digital channel marketing, appropriate for fundraisers, which is obviously the topic of today, but also appropriate for any Marcoms campaigns that you might be running. So feel free to share with colleagues. So moving swiftly on to tip one. Tip one is probably not completely new to you, but I'll explain a little bit about why I think this is a really important tip today. Tip one is build a hypothesis matrix. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of a hypothesis. It goes along the lines of, if we do X, then we believe Y will happen, and sometimes as a result of Z. The reason this is so useful is that certainly we use these in kind of concert with our testing plans, which are perhaps a level down from the hypothesis matrix, which I think is a tool that you sit on top of more detailed granular testing. So the reason it's important at the moment is some of the tips that I'm going to go on to share in a minute talk about sort of maybe newer and more emerging tactics and strategies that you can use. And the thing with those is I think it's really important to understand the context in which you're using them, particularly if you're going to use them in parallel with existing activity, sort of run rate, business as usual advertising or marketing that you're doing. You kind of need to know, well, we're going to introduce this new activity, and the reason for introducing that is the hypothesis that we've put together that's going to change the landscape of our marketing. So for instance, you might create quite a big hypothesis, like, well, if we start to use some of the new audience building features in Facebook, we expect after a 6-month period to have increased our Facebook fan base by 10%. And then below that, you can put in all the tests that apply to that hypothesis. So, this campaign here is going to target this particular audience with this call to action to see what happens. So you can see how that kind of cascades down into your testing plans, which I'm sure you have for your digital marketing activity. We find it's really helpful to put this hypothesis on top. Tip number 2, focus on audience building. I mentioned audience building a minute ago. This is becoming more important in digital marketing today. The reason it's becoming more important, I think, is because of the changes that we've seen over the past few years in things like privacy and data sharing, data privacy. So obviously we all know we had GDPR came first, then sort of PECA was updated to being in line with that. There have been more guidance on things like cookie privacy and cookie acceptance. And most recently we had the Apple's iOS update, which affected all apps through the App Store, in particular Facebook. So then that was a big deal, which means people have to now actively accept to be tracked across their apps and websites through the iPhone. So because of this, what this means is it affects our targeting strategies, which rely on conversions, tracking, and remarketing. So one way to combat that is to look at audience building, so that we can actually own the audiences with their permission or with platform tools, in order that we can carry on speaking to them, carry on monitoring conversion, and carry on recontacting them through remarketing. So a good example of that is focusing on something like video views in Facebook. By doing that, we can build audiences based on interactions with the videos that we put in that platform, and kind of create that audience as distinct within the platform, which means we can then remarket to that audience based on the content that we know they interacted with, which we were able to do before, but it's more important now because we can't do some of the recontacting strategies from things like click-throughs to websites. On speaking of websites, the other thing that I think is useful to consider here is your opt-in strategies on your destinations, because obviously when we obtain opt-in for communications through digital, we then have that opportunity to use that to build audiences within the platforms we want to use. So that's a good tip as well, to use opt-ins on your site. Tip number 3. We do talk a lot about Facebook. It's because it is obviously one of the largest platforms that we can use to reach our audiences. Recently, the platform has introduced some new targeting options, which you may or may not be familiar with. And these are sort of enhancing the ways in which we can reach people. Again, particularly important because if we're grappling with privacy, we need to use all the tools in our arsenal in order to reach the right people. And some really interesting ones that are in there. I mean, they're quite extensive, so do go away and investigate the detail within this. But some interesting ones that we find are becoming helpful are things like we can create segments for ad interactions now, which we couldn't do before. Whereas previously you could create segments for interactions with your general post content, including advertising. We can now be much more granular, and that's really helpful if you're running campaigns. And Facebook have introduced a number of more broader segments that are handy as well. A couple that you might find useful to investigate are things like there's now a broad segment for checkout initiation, very useful if you're running online donations, and a segment for website interaction, including percentile of time spent on site, so you can figure out who your most engaged users using that kind of segmentation, and then supply different messaging to those audiences. Tip number 4. This is about broadening your targeting and then using self-identification collateral in order to get the right audiences. So quite often you max out your audiences in some of the online platforms and don't know where to go. And one of the ways to attract new audiences is to say, well, I'm going to use broader criteria, a bit more like demographic stuff that you would use in more traditional marketing, age, gender, location, things like that. But of course, when you go really broad, you potentially reach a lot more people, many of whom aren't relevant to target for your cause. So the way to make sure you get the right people is to use self-identification content, by which we mean imagery and copy largely that speak to that individual, to reflect back to them that your cause is the kind of thing that they need. It's also used, and we've seen this used really well in service delivery too, if you happen to do that within your charity, because it sort of it puts a mirror up effectively to the person, so you attract only the people that are relevant to your cause. Great again for audience expansion. Tip number 5. Try lead forms if you haven't already, for value exchange campaigns and for hand raising. So one of the briefs that we quite often get is around how do we build a new donor prospect pool. Obviously, we've got the tactics that I've already mentioned, but one tactic we use is lead forms. So if you're not familiar with these are in-platform data capture devices. Facebook and Instagram are the most common, that allow you to capture data and obtain permission from those users within the platform so they don't need to leave. And then you can, download or extract that data from the platform to use it elsewhere. The most effective ways of doing this are things like value exchange. So you have a product or service that you can offer in exchange for that data. The more data you want to collect, the more valuable the product needs to be. So physical products are really good for collecting postal data or telephone data. Digital products are better for collecting email. And once you've done that, obviously, you can then look at your onward journey for the person that you started to interact with. Hand raisers are similar, but of course, they're much more lightweight. So probably you want a more digital journey for hand raisers where people are just sort of indicating they're interested in your cause or your message. And what we found is that you can get really quite a low cost per lead going on with these campaigns. So definitely worth a look, particularly if you do lead gen in other areas. Tip number 6. Expand beyond Facebook. Now, I know this seems kind of obvious in a lot of ways because there are many platforms that we can use. But I think what I've seen is a trend really in marketing to sort of default to Facebook whenever you want a campaign, especially if you say, it's almost like paid social has become synonymous with let's do a Facebook campaign. And I think one of the reasons that that's a bit precarious is that it's really not ideal to be beholden to one platform. And we've seen, particularly in the wake of the American US presidential elections, that the regulations sitting within Facebook advertising and marketing are much more strict. And particularly if you're doing cause-based marketing, you can get pulled up for those messages, and sometimes have your account disabled for a period of time until you make the case to re-enable it again. So being connected only to that, or largely to the Facebook platform, is a flaw in a marketing strategy. So one of the things that's really useful to consider is, what are you doing within your social advertising, your Facebook advertising? It could be easily ported to one of the other platforms. The most obvious candidates for that are, say, Twitter or something like Pinterest, because the formats are pretty similar. And what are the channels that maybe are you underusing that you could use to even out that landscape of marketing activity? A really good one that I would advocate is using the Google platform to do Gmail placements. So these are promoted messages that you see as a user within your Gmail inbox. They act a little bit like emails, but of course they're paid advertising. So obviously you can control the content, you can control the destination click through, and you can track conversion. And what we've seen there is actually, if you track through the funnel and compare with a platform like Facebook, sometimes the other platforms look a bit more expensive, but when you track all the way through to eventual conversion, you can actually see a different picture altogether. So we ran a campaign not that long ago comparing Facebook and Gmail side by side. Facebook was cheaper for sure, but actually the better converting campaigns came from Gmail users who were more engaged to begin with and converted considerably higher, sort of tens of % higher than the Facebook opportunities that we achieved. So well worth investigating all the platforms and do some testing. Tip number 7, and one for those of you who use search. One of the typical things that we find with search is that if you've been running it for some time, actually what you do is you start to reach the limits of how you can do new things and how you can obviously optimize and make improvements. But there's a limitation, I think, on how far you can expand that without using some other tactics. So one of the ways that you can do that, and this is especially good if you have an information-rich website, is to implement what's called dynamic search ad campaigns. If you're not familiar with dynamic search ad campaigns, they instead of you deliberately targeting certain keyword pools, you ask Google to figure out what they are for you based on your website content. So it's sort of like you point the campaigns at the site and say, figure out what the best keyword match is for this website. So as I say, really good if you have a lot of content. And the way that's useful actually is to find new keyword opportunities that you maybe didn't have before, which again leads you to new audiences that you weren't speaking to, by allowing Google to expose those opportunities out to you based on the content you already have. So it's actually quite a quick win in a lot of ways. You don't need to do lots of content planning to do DSA campaigns. You actually just use the content you already have. And the other thing it allows you to do is to understand keyword and content alignment. So if DSA, for instance, are not picking up content that you know you have, and you're kind of wondering, well, why is that? Maybe it's that the keyword richness within the content you've got is maybe not that well suited to search. So then you can do a bit of an exercise in realigning the content that you've got based on keyword opportunities you found through research. So DSA campaigns really do offer you a kind of slightly different dynamic to your search. Tip number 8, and I think this is probably one more for the earlier adopters amongst you. I think it's time to start experimenting more with conversational messaging and campaigns. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, and many of you might have experimented with this in things like on-site chat. That's probably the first place that people start. The opportunities that sit within conversational are really quite large. Everything from, as I say, on-site chat with maybe a hybrid of a bot plus a real person, perhaps once you've routed through some of the chatbots options, through to things like voice skills with things like Amazon Alexa and Google Home, and now into advertising, and that's obviously where I think there's lots of the early adopter stuff going on. Worth looking at Google's AdLingo opportunity. That's a new product from Google, which does completely native conversational advertising, which is driven by artificial intelligence. But even if you don't want to go that far, it's still possible to create interactive things like display ads, which have a kind of a conversational feel to them, a kind of interactive element where you can ask people to select certain choices, and based on their choices, ask them something else. I think this is really getting into consumer consciousness with regards to how people interact with things like messaging now. They are expecting brand experiences that are more interactive and more conversational. And it helps you shortcut the marketing funnel and the fundraising funnel, because if you can qualify people through your marketing activities and your on-site interactions without using people, what you can do is get them further down your funnel, that decision-making tree, before you have a richer interaction and engagement with them. So I think it's definitely time to start looking at what might the conversation opportunities be for your charities. Tip number 9 is reconsider your campaign objectives. So you're all, I'm sure, running campaigns within all the platforms that you have access to. I think it's good. It's kind of good hygiene, really, to every now and then look at what your campaign objectives are across the board, or if you're creating new campaigns, reconsider what is the best opportunity and the best objective for this campaign. Many of you will use things like optimize for clicks or optimize for conversions in your campaigns, but perhaps think, are those the best you can use? Quite often what we see is opportunities to move from click-oriented or conversion-oriented campaigns to something like smarter bidding strategies like target cost per acquisition or target return on ad investment. Because that allows you to get the platforms to do some of the heavy lifting on optimizing your campaigns. If you go for target CPA, for instance, you can say to the platform, I'm looking to achieve this conversion action at £20 each. Optimize my campaigns and the budgets and the bidding strategies to achieve that, which shortcuts some of the analysis that you might want to do and how you do it yourself. And there's lots and lots of options for smarter strategies here. You may find that what you need to do in order to achieve that is to look at how you track and implement some of the different analytics and tracking capabilities on your actual digital properties in order to achieve them. But knowing they're out there and knowing what you might need to do is the first step to doing that. And then you can say, we're going to put together a little mini project where we want to move to target CPA for these sets of campaigns. Donor acquisition campaigns are an obvious candidate, but of course there's many different actions that you might want to achieve a certain CPA for, based on the value you know that's going to deliver if you achieve it. So we're going to go for target CPA for these campaigns. What do we need to do with our online property to put the tracking in place in order that the platforms can use their algorithms and use their technology in order to achieve that? So that's tip number 9. And lastly, tip number 10. Ensure you use conversion-oriented destinations. Again, it seems straightforward, but actually there's quite a lot of richness within this idea. If you're doing donor recruitment activity, the key platform that you probably want to make sure is highly conversion optimized, it will be your donation funnel. You want it to see best practice UX within that platform. You'll want to be doing all the kind of psychographic cues, using content which is aligned with campaigns, all of that rich experience. And sometimes, for practical reasons, you find that actually a one-size-fits-all destination is actually being used when really it could be tailored for conversion optimization. The reason this is so important is that you can do all the channel marketing you like, but if your destination is not oriented towards conversion, you're missing an opportunity to get the best value from the campaigns that you're running. For things that aren't around donor conversion, like at the bottom of that funnel, but maybe towards the top of the funnel, obviously landing pages can be conversion oriented. It might be that they're not conversion oriented towards a transaction at that stage, but knowing the conversion that you're looking for and then creating or adapting a landing page to fit that is really important. And as I said before, if you're going for some of the smarter strategies, you need to be clear about what tracking needs to be implemented within that landing page. And the other thing that we see quite a lot is that clients have websites with many different pages, some of which could be used as landing pages for campaigns. But sometimes, for whatever reason, they're maybe not kind of completely aligned with the campaign action or what we're asking people to do, or the messaging, but they still get used anyway because it's the best page that we've got. And I think if that's the case, I would strongly advocate looking at landing page tools that exist out there. There's a whole bunch of them. We use Instapage, for instance, for some of the stuff we do, but there's one called Unbounce, and there's a bunch of other ones too. And if you have a marketing platform that you use for marketing automation, you'll find there's tools in there too. That's really a useful avenue if you don't have a really well-aligned page, is to use one of those tools, and just because they're quite quick to use, you can attach them to your domain so they look like legitimate, and you can then run them next to your site. If for any reason you think that, well, actually the landing page that we think we've got on our site is pretty good, but we've got some other ideas for what this might look like, clearly you can run them side by side. Do a split test with your advertising or your marketing activity and say, well, we're going to send 50% of the traffic to the website landing page, which we think is pretty well optimized, and 50% to this slightly different way of looking at conversion through a landing page tool, assess the outcomes, and then make some decisions about whether you actually port some of that learning into the main website, or whether you do more tests. So I think that's it's one to reflect on, because I think sometimes in channel marketing you can get quite focused on what's happening in the platform, particularly as I mentioned, all the changes with privacy and the platform's desire to kind of keep you in that platform. But the destinations that you have are ultimately how you're going to acquire the supporter that you're looking for. So don't lose focus on that. So there you go. Those are my top 10 tips for digital fundraisers and digital marketers alike. To summarize, as you can see, there's quite a lot of options to try out. These are the top line headlines for the tips, but beneath that sits a level of detail that you can go away and really dig into. So there's lots to be trying. It's important to understand, if you are going to try some of these things, how to evaluate them over time. So that's the hypotheses matrix and the tracking stuff that I've been talking about. And as I just mentioned, all of this stuff needs to be supported by an engaging destination and engaging content more broadly, which aligns between the channel activity you're doing and the message that you're providing to people on site and through the donation funnel in order to get the most value from your activity. So there you go. Thank you very much. We're about 3 minutes off the allotted time, but we can do questions if there are any. I don't know if if my colleagues have spotted any in the chat. I don't see any in the Q&A.
No, I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any in the chat, Dan.
Let's have a look at the chat here.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one that popped up, Dan, that says, could you give an example of what the landing page tools that exist?
Sure, and I mentioned a couple of them just now. So Instapage is the one that we found to be the most lightweight and flexible, just to quickly put together pages, and it's pretty easy to use. So you don't need a designer for. I mean, you always need a designer. So apologies to the designers in the virtual room. You don't need somebody technical to build the page. You can create the pages yourself as a non-technical user. Clearly, you need to apply good design best practice. I misspoke there. Unbounce is another one we've evaluated before. That's also really good. And I think also one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about landing pages is obviously there are tools which you can overlay on existing pages that you've got, which act like in-context testing tools. So your kind of your Hotjars and your Google Website Optimize in order to plug in like mini tests, mini split tests within the pages. If you want to say, well, you know, I want to test 2 different calls to action, but on the same page, or 2 different form fields on the same page. So there's those tools as well that you can use. Any other questions? Use rather than website pages. So the question is, why would you use landing page tools rather than regular website pages? Well, it's obviously the situation that most websites will use a variety of different content management systems and technology in order to power them. So quite a lot of the time, we find that clients maybe get a bit stuck in that avenue. Maybe they can't create the pages that they want for landing pages. So it's just a practical situation. We need a landing page and it's difficult to get it to do what we want. We also find that sometimes there's a lot of pressure on internal digital teams if they're the ones running the website. So actually we find that if you need to get to market quite quickly, but the lead time with the digital team is a bit longer than you need, it provides a useful, slightly more nimble option, an avenue. And some of them incorporate, as I said, sort of those kind of multivariate split testing features, because really what they're designed to do is to allow you to test landing pages. So actually they have some useful features that you can use in order to achieve the kind of tests that you would like to. So those are some of the reasons why you might use tools rather than your website CMS. Thanks, Joe, for that question. Any further questions?
I think we're at 10 o'clock now, Dan, so that's good.
There's one more question if anybody wants to stay on. Oh. Sophia says, what is the best way to optimize content to increase conversion? Wow, that is a big question, Sophia. Thanks for asking that. It's probably a webinar in itself. I would say probably this, if I'm going to give one answer to that question, I think it's around insight. It's about having insight about who are you speaking to and what's the journey that you're trying to do, because insight powers everything effectively. We talked a lot about strategies and tactics for digital marketing campaign execution this morning. We didn't really touch on the fact that you need insights to begin with, or at least if you don't have it, know what you're missing. Because if you can understand that, you know, we think like the hypothesis I mentioned earlier, we think that, let's just say we're an animal charity. We think that if we create some engaging content about our work with rescue dogs, and we align that with Facebook's interest-based targeting on dog lovers, what we're going to find is through the funnel, we're going to increase conversion for supporters who are interested in supporting rescue dog charities. And all of that is based on either an insight that says we've done some market research and we found that people who are interested in dogs have an affinity with rescue dogs. Seems obvious. I know this is a bit of a blunt instrument, this answer. Or we can say we think this, we hypothesize this, and we're going to go test it. And then, of course, the insight that you learn from that allows you to do other things or to do more of that sort of thing. So I would say that's probably the single answer to your question, is obtain insight in order to develop content, in order to increase conversion. Thanks for asking that question. As Vicky says, we're a little over time, but I'm in no particular hurry. I know there's a few people still on the call, so does anybody else have any questions? It doesn't seem like there are any more questions, so all it remains to say is thank you very much for attending. As I mentioned at the top of this webinar, there's one more next week, and that will be the end of our set of 4 top 10 tips. We will be doing more as we move into the autumn. So if you're interested in fundraising strategy and you'd like to hear from Claire Daniels, do sign up on the same link that you signed up for this one. And if you do, see you next week at 9:30. Thank you.